It happened inside a glittering restaurant where wealth and power seemed untouchable. The chandeliers glowed, the tables were set with silver, and men in expensive suits spoke in languages most around them did not understand. But in the middle of this display of privilege stood a young black waitress, carrying herself with quiet dignity. She was just doing her job, unaware that within seconds she would be dragged into a moment that would test her very soul. A billionaire, confident in his arrogance, thought he could say something cruel and degrading in Arabic, believing she would never understand. The laughter of his friends echoed, certain they had witnessed a joke at her expense. But what none of them expected was the silence that followed, a silence heavy enough to cut through the air just before something unforgettable happened. What would you do if someone tried to shame you in a language they thought you could never speak? Her name was Amina. She was 26 years old, a young woman who carried a world of responsibility on her shoulders. Every morning she woke before the sun, tying her hair back and preparing for another long shift at one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. To the wealthy guest who walked in, she was invisible, just another waitress gliding between tables, refilling glasses, smiling politely, no matter how tired she was. But behind her quiet presence was a story that few ever cared to know. Amina had come from a modest family, raised by a mother who taught her the value of dignity, respect, and hard work. She worked not for luxury but for survival, saving every coin she earned to help her younger brother through school, to keep her family afloat. Her dream was simple: stability, a life where she no longer had to worry about the rent due at the end of each month. Inside the restaurant, everything sparkled. Expensive suits, polished marble floors, conversations in foreign languages. It was a world designed to remind people of status. But for Amina, it was simply her workplace, a place where she had learned to carry herself with grace no matter how heavy the weight of exhaustion became. She smiled when people ignored her. She stayed calm when they treated her like she was less than human. Yet inside, she always carried a quiet strength, a resilience born from years of pushing forward in the face of disrespect. Still, the truth was this: no amount of strength can prepare someone for the sting of humiliation. And Amina had felt it more than once. The subtle comments about her skin, the way some guests waved her off without even making eye contact, the assumption that she did not belong in such a refined space. She swallowed those moments because walking away was never an option. But deep down, each one carved its mark. And then came that night, the night that would change everything. The restaurant was crowded with elite guests, people who thought money gave them the right to mock and belittle. Amina moved quickly between the tables, her footsteps steady, her expression calm, unaware that in a matter of moments, she would be singled out in front of everyone. What began as an ordinary evening at work would soon become a turning point in her life, and in the lives of those who witnessed it. Because sometimes the cruelest moments come without warning, and sometimes the most unexpected voices rise from the shadows. The evening unfolded with its usual rhythm. Waiters moved like shadows, trays balanced with practiced grace, the quiet hum of a piano drifting through the dining hall. Amina worked her way through the tables with her steady smile, carrying the silent pride of someone who had taught herself not to crumble. But beneath the glow of chandeliers, she could feel it: the eyes, the gaze of men who measured worth not by humanity, but by money and skin. At one corner table, laughter rose above the soft clinking of glasses. A group of wealthy businessmen sat back in leather chairs, their voices sharp, careless, and loud enough for the room to notice. Among them was a man whose presence commanded attention, a billionaire known not only for his wealth but for his arrogance. His suit gleamed with subtle detail. His watch caught the light like a crown jewel. To his peers, he was untouchable. To those who served him, he was a storm waiting to strike. Amina approached their table with practiced professionalism. She lowered her eyes slightly, not out of shame, but out of discipline, a shield she had worn for years. She poured their drinks, placed their plates, and nodded politely at their empty thanks. But as she turned to leave, the sound of a word cut through the air like a blade. A word spoken in Arabic. A word heavy with insult, directed At her. The men erupted into laughter. It was the kind of laughter that is not shared but weaponized, meant to remind someone of their place. They thought they had found a joke, safe behind the barrier of language. To them, she was just a waitress, a black woman who could not possibly understand the sting hidden within those syllables. But Amina froze. She understood. Every letter of it, every mocking intention behind it, she absorbed with the full weight of its meaning. For a split second, the tray in her hand trembled. Her chest tightened, her breath caught between pride and fury. But she kept walking, her silence misunderstood as ignorance. The men leaned closer, their voices growing bolder, layering insult upon insult, convinced they were invisible behind their foreign tongue. The restaurant seemed unchanged to others. The music still played, the glasses still clinked. But for Amina, the room had shifted. Each step she took felt heavier, the echo of their laughter chasing her down the polished floor. She thought of her mother's words of dignity, of endurance. But she also felt the crack of injustice inside her chest, a familiar wound that had been opened too many times. She placed her tray down in the service corner, her hands trembling against the polished wood. Memories surged, moments of being ignored, moments of being dismissed, moments of being treated as though her worth was measured only by what she could carry. But this was different. This was louder. This was meant to break her in front of everyone. And yet she did not break. The night went on, and she continued to serve with her calm expression. But inside, a storm was building. Every laugh from that table added fuel. Every careless word became another match against her dignity. She could feel eyes on her, wondering if she knew. Some guests glanced, others pretended not to hear, but silence has a way of siding with power. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his arrogance growing with each insult. To him, this was entertainment. To his peers, it was a show of dominance. They watched her walk by, smirking, knowing she was trapped in her role. Trapped, they thought, because people like her were not expected to speak. But Amina's silence was not submission. It was choice. She was waiting. She was weighing every second, every word, knowing that timing mattered more than reaction. As she returned to their table to clear the plates, the men unleashed another round of cruelty. Their voices dripped with superiority, their eyes daring her to break. And for a moment, it seemed as though she might. Her hand tightened around the edge of a glass, her knuckles white against the strain. But then she exhaled slowly, set it down, and turned her gaze directly to the man who had insulted her. For the first time that evening, she allowed her eyes to meet his. There was no smile, no polite mask, only a steady calm that unsettled him. The laughter faltered just slightly. A pause entered the air, brief but noticeable, like the silence before a storm breaks. The restaurant remained unaware of the battle taking shape at that table. Other guests continued to talk, to eat, to sip their wine. But within that small circle, the air was tightening. The billionaire shifted in his seat, brushing it off with another insult, another attempt to reassert control. His voice rose louder, daring her once more. And that was when it happened, the moment when patience snapped and silence gave way to something stronger. Amina placed the last plate down, adjusted her posture, and spoke. Not in English, not in French, but in Arabic. The first word cut through the air like thunder. The men froze. The sound of her voice carried the weight of knowledge, of fluency, of defiance they had never imagined possible. What they thought was their private language had just become the weapon turned against them. And the billionaire, who had mocked her with such confidence, suddenly found himself exposed. The first word she spoke was enough to silence the table. The men who had mocked her only moments ago froze in disbelief, their laughter cut short like a song abruptly ended. Her voice was steady, fluent, and sharp, each syllable in Arabic carrying weight that pierced through the arrogance sitting before her. She did not stumble. She did not hesitate. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had been underestimated her entire life, and now refused to be invisible. The billionaire's face shifted from smug amusement to shock, then to anger. His lips tightened, his jaw clenched, and his eyes darted toward his companions. as though begging them not to show their surprise. But it was too late. The room around them seemed smaller, the glow of chandeliers harsher, as if the light itself had turned against him. Every guest within earshot felt the tension ripple like a storm tearing through glass. Amina did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her calm fluency was louder than any insult. She explained, still in Arabic, that she had heard every word, that she understood every cruel joke, every attempt to humiliate her. She told him she was not the shadow he thought. She was not the servant he could belittle without consequence. She told him she carried her mother's lessons, her family's pride, and the strength of every person who had ever been dismissed as less than human. And with each sentence, the billionaire's power cracked. The laughter from his table did not return. His companions shifted uncomfortably, their eyes lowering, their confidence dissolving under the weight of her presence. The arrogance that had filled the air only minutes earlier was gone, replaced by silence so heavy it felt suffocating. But humiliation has its own kind of danger. The more she spoke, the redder his face became. His pride was unraveling in front of an audience, and for men like him, pride was everything. He slammed his hand against the table, the silverware rattling with the force of his anger. He barked out another insult, louder this time, desperate to reassert control. But it fell flat. No laughter followed. No one joined him. His cruelty now looked pathetic, his power small. Still, the damage was not just to his ego. In that moment, Amina felt the weight of the room shift against her. The silence from other guests, the nervous glances of her fellow waiters, the sudden tension in the air. It was clear. She had broken the unspoken rule. Stay silent, endure, and remain invisible. Now, she had stepped out of line. Her chest tightened as she realized the danger of what she had done. Yes, she had spoken her truth, but what would it cost? Would her job survive this? Would her safety? Would the restaurant protect her, or the billionaire? She stood with dignity, but inside, fear gnawed at her ribs like claws. The billionaire's voice roared across the hall, demanding the manager. His finger pointed directly at her. His words spitting venom in two languages now, switching between Arabic and English, his fury boiling over. He wanted her gone. He wanted her punished. He wanted to erase the moment that had shattered his superiority. Every second stretched like eternity. The staff froze. The guests watched in stunned silence, and Amina stood alone in the center of it all, her courage blazing, her future trembling on the edge of collapse. And then, just as his rage reached its peak, she took a single step closer to him. Her voice cut through the storm, calm, unwavering, and final. Now everyone knows who you are. The words struck harder than any insult, because they carried a truth he could never erase. The room gasped, a collective inhale of disbelief, and before the billionaire could answer, before anyone could react, everything in the restaurant changed. The restaurant had fallen into an uneasy silence. The billionaire's anger still hung in the air, but something had shifted. His words no longer carried power. His rage was no longer entertainment. Instead, it looked small, ugly, exposed in front of the very people he had hoped to impress. Amina stood tall, her hands steady, her breath even. She had not raised her voice. She had not begged for respect. She had simply spoken the truth. And that truth had pierced deeper than any insult ever could. The manager rushed over, his face pale, his eyes darting between the furious billionaire and the young waitress who had just defied him. For a brief moment, the weight of wealth and influence seemed certain to crush her. The billionaire's demands came loud and harsh, that she be removed, that she be punished, that no one forget who held the money in the room. Yet as he shouted, the other guests remained silent, their eyes fixed not on him but on her. Some looked ashamed, others inspired, but all of them knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. Amina expected the worst. She had seen enough to know how these stories usually ended, with the powerful protected and the vulnerable discarded. But as the tension stretched, something unexpected happened. A few guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to each other. One woman placed her napkin down and stood, quietly walking out. Another shook her head, muttering words of disgust at the man who had made a spectacle of his cruelty. Slowly, the billionaire's dominance crumbled, not because he was silenced, but because people no longer wanted to listen. Amina was not fired that night. She continued her shift, her dignity intact, though her heart still pounded with fear and adrenaline. When the billionaire finally stormed out, leaving behind his untouched plate, the room seemed lighter, as though the very walls had been holding their breath. She finished her work in silence, but inside, a fire burned. She had been mocked, humiliated, and threatened, but she had also proved something undeniable: that dignity cannot be taken by wealth and that silence does not always mean ignorance. In the days that followed, whispers of the story spread beyond the restaurant walls. Some retold it as gossip, others as inspiration. For Amina, it was not about fame or recognition. It was about survival, about standing up for herself in a place where she was never meant to have a voice. She knew the risks she had taken, knew that many in her position would never dare to respond. But she also knew this: had she remained silent, the laughter would have lived on, another moment where cruelty went unchallenged. Her story is not just hers. It echoes the experiences of countless others who face insults in languages meant to exclude them, who endure the sting of being treated as less because of the color of their skin. It reminds us that racism is not always loud. It hides in laughter, in whispers, in the arrogance of those who believe they will never be challenged. And it reminds us that courage does not always come in shouts or protests. Sometimes it comes in a single steady voice, spoken at the right moment. Amina walked home that night under the quiet streetlights, her steps slow, her thoughts heavy. She had not defeated racism, she had not dismantled injustice, but she had made one man tremble, she had made a room pause, and she had reminded herself that silence was no longer her prison. That was enough to carry her forward. So the question remains: when cruelty hides behind privilege, when mockery disguises itself as untouchable power, who among us will choose to stay silent, and who will dare, like Amina, to speak?